Hi there, I'm Judy Holland, and welcome to Happy Nest, the podcast where you can hear the latest research and best advice for living well when your kids leave home. Join me as I interview experts and explore how to reinvent yourself during this critical passage. I hope you'll head over to judyhollandauthor.com and check out my new book, Happy Nest, Finding Fulfillment When Your Kids Leave Home. Joining me today on this episode of Happy Nest is a writer, scholar, and speaker, Emily Esfahani Smith. Emily has written a great and soulful book called The Power of Meaning. It's an international bestseller that has struck a chord worldwide. Emily explores why so many people feel aimless and alienated in modern life. She says human suffering can come from focusing on the wrong goal. Instead of chasing happiness, you should search for meaning. Meaning is what makes life worth living. She recommends we find a sense of belonging and purpose. We also should tell ourselves positive stories about our lives and seek transcendence. We can find transcendence many ways, including by meditating, being in nature, listening to music, going to a museum, or serving others. Emily draws on psychology, philosophy, and literature, including some of my favorite thinkers, Tolstoy and Gandhi. Her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and other publications. She has also appeared on NBC's The Today Show, CBS This Morning, and NPR. I found Emily when I was writing my own book, Happy Nest, Finding Fulfillment When Your Kids Leave Home. After your kids go, you might start wondering, what really matters? You've been busy caring for others, making a living, building a career. Now that the dust has settled, what's next? How are you going to use your remaining time well? It feels like time is running out. So how do you find purpose and meaning at this stage? I'm delighted to have Emily with us today, sharing her research on how to live well.
You know, Emily, I get how people would become obsessed with happiness. I mean, that's understandable, isn't it?
Definitely. I think, in positive psychology, the field that I studied in graduate school, we learn about Aristotle, and Aristotle is often translated as saying that the whole purpose of a man's life is the pursuit of happiness. And in the Declaration of Independence, we have, everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I think that there is this kind of, idea, and I think it's especially true in the West, less so in Eastern cultures, that the human life is about kind of moving towards happiness. Happiness is the be all end all of life.
So, Emily, as human beings, we inevitably suffer pain and loss, and someday we're all going to die. And that makes every human being wonder, what does it all mean? Existential philosophers and great thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Tolstoy, and Albert Camus, all of whom you quoted in your wonderful book, spend a lot of time on this issue. Why might existential questions loom especially large for empty nesters?
So I would say, it's a great question. And if you think about, when I was researching my book, The Power of Meaning, I spoke to a lot of people about what makes their lives meaningful, what gives them purpose and meaning and a sense of identity, a role to play. And for most people, it wasn't, these big, grand things like, working on a cure for cancer or being elected to public office. It was the stuff of everyday life. And in particular, for parents, the thing I heard again and again is my children. My children are my purpose. They're what give my life meaning. So if you think about, becoming an empty nester, you've spent, 18 years, or, more if you have more children, devoting yourself to helping them grow up, to helping them develop, taking them to sports practice. It's a very powerful sense of purpose because you constantly have things to do, and the things that you're doing are, for the sake of someone beyond yourself. And that's kind of the definition of meaning. It's connecting to something beyond yourself. So now that that's gone, there's this emptiness that a lot of empty nesters have to deal with. This really powerful source of meaning in my life is now out of the house, off to college, whatever. And now what? Now what do I do? They're off into adulthood. I can't, my role as a parent is different and much more hands off now than it was. And that kind of leaves a lot of space, an opening, and also a hole, within you, within your spirit that you need to find a new way to fill. And so that's why I think becoming an empty nester poses an existential challenge.
Right. No, absolutely. So also, Emily, after you've raised children like I have, I raised 3 of them, busy scholars, athletes, singing in the choir, you name it. It's really exhausting and it strains. A lot of studies show that you see like a, 2/3 drop in marital satisfaction because basically you barely sometimes have time to even talk to or remember who the other person is because you're just, especially if you're working busy jobs, there's a lot going on. So once you get done with this whole marathon, partially done, we're not really done when they're not under our roof, but once you're mainly done with them under your roof, you're exhausted. So at this point, we're looking for a treat. Why not treat the empty nest like a permanent vacation? What's wrong with a life of hedonism, relaxation, hitting golf balls? Isn't that enough?
In my book, I make this argument that there's more to life than being happy, that we should, everyone is so focused on happiness, the pursuit of happiness, and we should really be directing our efforts towards the search for meaning and leading meaningful lives. And so, it may seem like, what I'm advocating is, all work and no fun, and that, we shouldn't pursue pleasure. But I don't quite see it that way. I think there's definitely room for pleasure and happiness in a meaningful life, but it's important to understand that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We need to have meaning in order to feel satisfied. Meaning, Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, said, is as important to our spiritual, emotional, psychological well-being as food, shelter, and water are to our physical well-being. And without meaning, we suffer. It means some people, that you fall into depression and despair. Some people become addicted to drugs or alcohol. Some people commit suicide. And we see that when people become empty nesters and move into this, next stage of life, which a lot of times also corresponds to retiring or making some sort of career change, they do experience these spikes in, depressive symptoms, in suicide, divorce. So it's this really kind of rocky period. And we think that, okay, things aren't going well. I feel depressed. I've lost a source of meaning. Maybe the solution is to make myself feel happier. But actually, the solution is to find a new source of meaning, something that can kind of satisfy you and replace the loss of the old one. Because trying to fill yourself up with pleasure and happiness, it might make you feel good in the moment, but it's not going to satisfy that hunger for something deeper that raising children provided.
Give me examples, Emily, so what you're talking about is eudaimonic well-being versus hedonic well-being, I believe. And give me examples, like what is what you speak of, seeking meaning. What kinds of activities bring that kind of meaning?
So, there's actually, a study that had people, the researchers told people to go out and pursue either, meaning or what you refer to as hedonia. Excuse me. The researchers went out and told people to pursue either meaning, which is what you refer to as eudaimonia, the Greek word for flourishing, to go out and pursue either meaning or go out and pursue happiness or hedonia. And what they found is that, people who went out and pursued meaning did things like, and these were students, but they did things like, practicing a musical instrument, visiting somebody sick at the hospital, volunteering, working on a project that was important to them, forgiving somebody, having a really powerful conversation with somebody. So these things that sometimes were stressful, not always easy, but that were bigger. And then people who did things that produced happiness, did things like, getting manicures, eating ice cream, playing video games, these kind of things that bring
shopping.
Sure, but
shopping and going to parties, Emily? Can I shop and go to parties and be in a hedonic lifestyle?
Exactly. There you go.
I like shopping and going to parties, right? But not for the deep, real meaning.
Yeah, if it's all you're doing, a happy life is not necessarily a meaningful life. If you want a meaningful life, you should be doing, things beyond just shopping and going to parties. And I think for people in this, the empty nester stage of life, certainly like volunteering or finding mentorship opportunities, those kinds of things make sense, but also doing things to deepen your spiritual life, I think is really important. There's psychologists and different spiritual traditions have conceived of life in these different stages, and the kind of stage where you're moving into old age, the purpose of that stage, these traditions and psychologists say, is to deepen your spiritual life, to kind of ask yourself big questions, to answer those questions, to engage with something transcendent, whether that's God or nature, whether it means meditating more, volunteering more. There are all kinds of ways to deepen your spiritual life, but that seems to be an important piece of restoring meaning at this point in life.
Right. No, absolutely. And I guess last question that I told you I was done, but I have one more here. Last question is, so spirituality, like, can you, I'm not a formally religious person, but I think I'm quite spiritual, and I call myself a borrower. I borrow things from Buddhism, Judaism, the Calvinist upbringing I was brought up with. I'm a borrower, and I kind of trade things in and morph as I go through time. But spirituality is a different thing. What is spirituality if we're not connecting it to a church?
Yeah, you hear so many people today describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. So I think spirituality, I think the definition of it is something like, just connecting to something bigger. And, I think when people say, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, what they mean is that they yearn for transcendence, they yearn for contact with something mysterious and awe-inspiring, but they don't want all the rules and dogma of a religious tradition. And so what they do is they do things like meditate, they go to concerts or listen to music, they engage with art. The art museum is kind of like the modern day, temple or church.
I love that.
Yeah. So these different ways where you can nature is a really powerful kind of way to engage with spirituality. Again, it's like just coming into contact with the mystery of life, with something that's awe-inspiring, that can kind of, bring you into stillness, make your small self disappear or dissipate anyways for a period of time, so that you can kind of connect with some larger truth.
That's wonderful. No, I think it's I don't think I fully understood what was spirituality just kind of in that sense until even a few years ago. But I now recognize that just being able to kind of sense the subtler vibrations and slow things down and just listen to the music, listen to the beat, look at a beautiful leaf and just kind of think about it differently. It's kind of centering and it's outside yourself. So I think that's wonderful. Why do so many people today feel aimless and alienated? In your book, you cite rising rates of depression in the United States, rising rates of suicide. That's scary. Why are people losing meaning in life?
I think there's a lot of different explanations for this. I think one of the explanations is that we used to have a lot of default sources of meaning, religion, community, family, tradition, rituals, structured rites of passage that help people move from one stage of life to another. And, society's modernized, and as people become more individualistic, leave home, school, and work, as society becomes more secular, these different kind of sources of meaning that once were kind of the architecture of people's lives, gave some scaffolding, some structure, are no longer there. And so people are left to discover on their own what makes life meaningful. And it's a beautiful opportunity, but it can also be a daunting challenge to some. And I think that a lot of people get really confused as they try to, figure out what they themselves want for their lives, what their parents want, what culture says they should do. And it's just really hard kind of figuring all those things out on your own, especially when you're young and making decisions about, who I am and what do I want to, do with the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's a quote that I found in your book. Happiness comes and goes, but meaning gives you something to hold on to. Or this may have come from our earlier interview when I interviewed you for my book, Happiness. Is meaning, Emily, necessarily something outside of ourselves? Here's a little quote definitely from your book. There are sources of meaning all around us, and by tapping into them, we can lead richer and more meaningful lives and help others do the same. What do you mean, Emily, there's meaning all around us?
So to your first question, I do think that, the defining feature of a meaningful life is connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself. And that could be, raising children, important work that you're doing, community, could be, connecting to nature, to God, these kind of, cosmic, transcendent sources of meaning. So there is certainly something about meaning that's, not about kind of gratifying, or focusing on the self, even though meaning can be gratifying personally, and, more about focusing outward to the world at large, to others, to, kind of pitching your own existence to something bigger. And, when I say that meaning is all around us, I think that, one of the things I learned writing my book is that there's this myth, I think in our culture prevalent that, you have to do something extraordinary to lead a meaningful life, whether that means ending a humanitarian crisis or starting a, major, company that changes the world in some way, finding a cure to a, terrible disease. Traveling, to India to find yourself, becoming a monk. But what I found is that actually meaning exists in like kind of the daily stuff of life, small interactions that you have with your, spouse or with the person at the coffee shop serving you coffee, or ways that you can, in my book, I write about storytelling as a pillar of meaning. So story about the story you tell yourself. So ways that you kind of interpret what's going on around you in a more, humane and hopeful way. Listening to a beautiful piece of music or reading, poetry, meditating, these things that do kind of, bring you into stillness and connect you to something beyond. These are things that we can like kind of bake into our daily lives, and they, on their own, they seem small, but when you kind of put it all together, there is this kind of, luminosity to life that really, lights up your life.
Uh-huh. So those are kind of, and I guess part of that is transcendent experiences, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. So in my book, I write about, 4 pillars of meaning. One of them is storytelling, which I mentioned. There's also belonging and purpose. And purpose is kind of where I would put, raising kids, and belonging as well. And then there's transcendence as the 4th pillar. And these are those, transcendent experiences are those moments when you feel kind of lifted above, ordinary experience, ordinary consciousness, and you come into contact with something that feels almost sacred and eternal. And that could be God. It could be just kind of this feeling of stillness. And there are, it could happen to be in, through an encounter with the natural world, some awe-inspiring sight. And there are lots of ways to kind of access and build this pillar, music and religion, religious rituals, but going to an art museum and kind of, engaging with a beautiful object, reading poetry. That's, one way that I do it. It really kind of slows you down, and is meditation, of course. So, and the reason these particular experiences of transcendence are meaningful is because they they make people feel like their sense of self has dissolved, and they make them, as the sense of self dissolves, they feel part of something much bigger than themselves, whether that's the universe or, ultimate consciousness or God, whatever you want to call it. And that thought that like I'm small, but I'm part of something vast, is very comforting.
We lose the kind of petty concerns and daily worries that come from too much focus on the self then.
Yeah, exactly. Those things kind of wash away and you realize they're not as important as you thought they were.
Uh-huh. Can we talk, Emily, about, you invoked Aristotle, and I'm a lover of Aristotle as well. Can we talk about eudaimonia and that idea versus eudaimonia versus hedonia? The whole idea, I've been really thought a lot about this lately because I'm kind of wondering, I've read there's research that kind of looks at the balance between eudaimonic or hedonic well-being, how we spend our time. I'm a kind of an eighth generation New England Calvinist by my roots, and I would say that I lean probably too heavily toward the eudaimonic side of things, and I'm wondering maybe I need a little sprinkle of hedonia a little bit more. But can you talk about eudaimonia? What's with that? Why does that give us meaning? Why is that especially important as we're getting a little older and we're empty nesters?
So, eudaimonia and hedonia are these ancient Greek words. And in my book, I translate them as meaning and happiness. So hedonia is about kind of experiences of pleasure, positive emotion, things like this. And I think that that's how, in colloquial, in the media, that's what people are thinking about when they think about happiness. Like, the big yellow smiley face, things that make us feel good. Eudaimonia, I said earlier that Aristotle often gets translated as saying that happiness is the end of life, the whole goal and purpose of life. And what he really says is that eudaimonia is the end goal of life and what we should be striving towards. And eudaimonia gets translated as happiness, but it's really something more like human flourishing, or, what I call, living a meaningful life. And Aristotle thought it was like this active thing that you do. It's not something that you feel. It's about kind of, living with virtue, maximizing the potential within you, contributing to your community. It's kind of, being involved with what's going on around you.
But it's hard work, isn't it, Emily? I mean, that's not fun to work hard, is it?
It is. It's definitely hard work. And I think that, raising children is a really good example of like a eudaimonic pursuit. It can be stressful. It requires sacrifice. It requires on you to call, up the best in you, love, compassion, generosity, wisdom, to kind of, be good at parenting.
Exhaustion. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Burnout. And certainly like there are moments of like, joy and love and positivity, but, there's a lot of struggling and pain as well. And so, I think it's important to not think that like there's no role for like hedonia, pleasure, happiness, whatever, in a good life. In my book, I just argue that, we're focused on the pursuit of happiness. And what we should maybe be focused on is the pursuit of meaning instead, because that actually kind of fills the existential void within us. We think that happiness does, but it's really meaning. And the great thing about pursuing meaning is that it often does lead to this deeper form of happiness, which I think, again, with raising kids, like a lot of parents talk about it as joy or contentment, or, when you see your kids out in the world, pride, this sense of like satisfaction that, of something that you put all this effort into something, and it's been a worthy endeavor. But there's also a role for like, happiness and pleasure and those other things too.
But then after the kids go, though, Emily, I mean, of course, there are boomerang kids, and there are kids with learning issues and other types of illnesses and problems that bring them back in and out of the nest. So it's not like empty nesters are necessarily scot-free. But how do we replace that? What's your advice to empty nesters for finding the good life after the kids go? you've put down, there's been a lot of hard work, a lot of eudaimonic direction when your kids were there. What would you suggest? How do we find true well-being at this phase? What does that have to do with altruism or issues that, things that are larger than ourselves?
So when I think about these questions, I kind of, my mind immediately goes to thinking about life in terms of stages. So, there's a great psychologist, 20th century psychologist named Erik Erikson, who kind of said that, there's different stages in life and different parts of life require you to master certain tasks. In Hindu thinking, there's a similar idea. There are these 4 stages of life. And you transition from one to the next, and each stage has its own goal. So in Hindu thinking, the midlife is kind of the stage. It's called the householder stage, and you're concerned with the affairs of the household, of raising your children, providing for the household through work, things like that. Then there's this other stage, which is called kind of retiring into the forest, and what it literally meant, historically back, in earlier times, was that you put aside your kind of worldly pursuits, and you go and you retire into the forest to be with the monks and the seekers and to learn from them and to devote yourself to kind of spiritual things. And Erik Erikson has a very similar conception of what, the last, third of life or whatever is about. It's about devoting yourself to kind of more spiritual, transcendent pursuits. And so I think that might be a good way to think about what comes next after the kids leave the home. It's like, if you do have a spiritual sensibility or a religious sensibility, it's connecting to that. For some people, that means, deepening their, religious rituals. For others, it means volunteering in their community, mentoring kids. Service, of course, is like a really important part of spiritual traditions. And even if you're a secular person, like there's something kind of very meaningful about serving the community. And Erik Erikson talked also specifically, and kind of jumping back and forth between the Hindu thing and the Erik Erikson thing, but they're very interrelated. But Erikson talked about in midlife, the thing that you want to master is generativity, which is kind of literally defined as, giving back to the earlier generations. Another way of thinking about it is like, it's not about you anymore. It's about what you give to the world. And so, raising children is a good example of generativity, but then once the children leave, like there are other ways to be generative, mentorship, foster kids, giving to others. There's some big and small ways, and you don't have to kind of change your life. There are ways within your own community or just daily existence, giving to your spouse in new ways, that can kind of satisfy this generativity piece.
And relationships are so important, right? And so giving to others, giving even to, this is something I'm very cognizant of now in kind of a new way now that I don't have so many kids running around my household. I'm more mindful. I take a few more seconds in the coffee shop and I engage more as I walk around and run into people. I listen to a young adult at my ballet bar class in the morning who's trying to juggle babies and a career. And I find that's a subtle, easy form of giving, but to me that brings great connectivity and joy. And I know that one of your pillars, right, is, I guess you call it belonging, but that would be quality relationships, right? Does that jive with what you've come up with?
Definitely. I think that, people who have a really strong community of friends and whatnot, that probably transitioning into empty nesting is a lot easier for them because they have this other pillar. And I've read about this in one of the chapters in my book on growth. Like when you experience any kind of adversity or loss, if these pillars are strong in your life, you'll have more support to kind of carry you through that loss or that life transition. And, speaking of the young woman in your ballet bar class, the other thing that, if you look at kind of mythology and traditional forms of philosophy that, think about like, what is the role of people in life in the last third of life or whatever. There's always this sense that like, as you got older and, your kids left and you weren't so much focused on work, that you assume the status of like an elder or one who kind of dispensed wisdom or, gave to the young people in that way. Like you've been through life and you've seen so much. And so there's a way to kind of like, give some of that insight that you attained like to them.
Right. And actually, I've just recently done a podcast on intergenerational relationships. I found a man at Penn State who studies this. And I'm finding this too, much to my shock and surprise. All these young women in their 30s actually think I have something to offer them in terms of, advice or just being a back, just for them to bounce ideas off of. And actually I do, because I've guided 3 kids in the midst of a career and I understand it. But, no, that's great. So wrapping up, Emily, revisit for me just in a 1, 2, 3 kind of way. What do you recommend? Like if you were telling your parent how to be, based on all your wonderful academic research, how to be more fulfilled in the empty nest, what would you suggest? 1, 2, 3.
I would suggest, one, deepen your spiritual life, whatever that means for you. That could mean going on, being in nature more, or, going to more religious services, or, performing religious rituals on a daily basis, meditating. So I think that's
music. Isn't music connected with spirituality?
Definitely. Yeah, exactly. It's another kind of portal to transcendence. And obviously, music is such an important part of religious rituals as well. So there's this kind of connection there. So deepening your spiritual life. I think that, there's an organization called Encore, which I write about in my book, which looks at people, in the second half of life.
Encore, ENCORE.
Yeah, exactly. And they have a great website. And a lot of these people, they retire from their first careers, but then they embark upon new careers, things that they wanted to do when they were younger but couldn't. And there are, Encore provides grants to kind of support people in that. So, think about, do you have like an encore in your life, another purpose that you want to, pursue now that you have the freedom and the time with kids out of the house. And then finally, I would say, like acts of service and kindness, whether they're big or small, whether it's, being kind of a listening ear to that person in your exercise class, or actually going out and volunteering in some new way in the community.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. No, I think this is great. And again, I love your book, The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. And it really made a difference for me. And I've actually marked it all up and thought about it and looked at it twice, read through it twice. So anyway, Emily, thank you very much for making time with me. I know you're a busy writer and reader and journalist. And thank you very much. And I'll be back in touch.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks for tuning into my Happiness podcast, where we explore how to get the best out of the empty nest. I hope you'll subscribe, write a review, and reach out to me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check out my website, judyhollandauthor.com. Have a great day, and remember, make it happen.